Hello viewers, thank you very much for subscribing to Gift TV and also watching our videos. Please, if you have not subscribed to our channel, kindly do so and also continue to share our videos. Today's lesson, we'll be looking at hypothesis discussion, specifically how to state your research hypothesis. Now let's dive into hypothesis. What is hypothesis? A hypothesis is a proposed explanation for a phenomenon, or it is a tentative answer to your research question that has not been tested. It can also be referred to as a statement that can be tested by scientific research. And if you want to test any relationship between two or more variables, you need to write your hypothesis before you start the experiment or the data collection. Additionally, a hypothesis states your prediction about what your research will find. Because of that, it is a good idea, okay, to state your hypothesis whenever you are doing a quantitative study. Note that for some research projects, you might have to write several hypotheses that address different aspects of your research question. So if you have one research question, it's a good idea to state one hypothesis. If you have two research questions, it's a good idea to state two hypotheses to test the research question. If you have three or more, you need to state three or more hypotheses, okay, according to the number of research questions that you have in your project. Scientists generally base scientific hypotheses on previous observations that cannot satisfactorily be explained with available scientific theories. Even though the word hypothesis and theory are often used interchangeably, scientific hypothesis is not the same as a scientific theory. Note that a hypothesis is not just a guess. It should be based on existing theory and knowledge. That is where the relationship comes in, but there is a difference. It also has to be testable. Hypothesis has to be testable, which means you can support or refute it through scientific research methods, such as experimental research, observations, and or some statistical analysis of data. Okay, you can see hypothesis testing in all these elements. Variables in hypothesis testing. Hypotheses propose a relationship between two or more types of research variables. As in our previous video, you saw research variables. In every hypothesis, you may see these two variables, dependent variable and independent variable. A dependent variable is something the researcher observes and measures. And an independent variable is something the researcher changes or controls to cause a change in the criterion variable or that of the dependent variable. Another word for the criterion variable is the dependent variable. Another word for the independent variable is the explanatory variable or regressors. If there are any control variables, extraneous variables, or confounding variables, be sure to jot those down as you go to minimize the chances that research bias will affect your results. You do that in order to avoid spurious results. You want to always avoid spurious results. There are 6 steps to follow to develop a good research hypothesis. First, ask a question. 2, do some preliminary research. 3, formulate your hypothesis. 4, refine your hypothesis. 5, phrase your hypothesis. 6, write down both the hypothesis and the alternative hypothesis. Let's take them one after the other. The first one, you ask a question. Writing hypothesis begins with a research question that you want to answer. The question should be focused, it should be specific and researchable within the constraint of your project. And you can watch the video on that of the research question from the previous lessons that we have in our YouTube channel. Example for this particular criteria are given below. 1, do students who attend more lectures get better exam results? You want to find out. You want to find out if lectures have any relationship with that of students' results or academic performance. And the second question that is also stated in this criteria is, how does educational output impact economic growth? You want to find out if education ideally has any effect or influence on economic growth. These are questions you want to find, you want to test. Then the second criteria or step is do some preliminary research. Your initial answer to the question should be based on what is already known about the topic. Look for theories, because there's a connection between hypothesis and a theory, but there's a difference. So look for theories and previous studies to help you form educated assumptions about what your research will find. At this stage, you might construct a conceptual framework to ensure that you are embarking on a relevant topic. And this can also help you identify which variables you study and what you think the relationships are between them. Sometimes you have to operationalize more complex construct so that you get a clear idea about the concept in its variable form. And there will be a video on the relationship between concept and variables. So watch out for those videos. The third step or criteria is formulate your hypothesis. Now you should have some idea of what you expect to find. So you write your initial answer to the question in a clear and concise sentence. A typical example: attending more lectures leads to better exams results. Because there may be some relationship between the rate at which students attend and pay attention to the lectures. It may have a direct influence on the outcome of the class. It's obvious. And as more educational output, where there's more enrollment in primary, free education, and all those elements may contribute to the development and growth of the country. So they are obvious. So more educational output leads to better economic growth. The fourth is to refine your hypothesis. You need to refine your hypothesis. You need to make sure your hypothesis is specific and testable. There are various ways of phrasing a hypothesis, but all the terms you use should have a clear definitions. And the hypothesis should contain the following: 1, the relevant variables, the specific group being studied, and the predicted outcome of the experiment or the analysis. 5, phrase your hypothesis. To identify the variable, you can write a simple prediction in if-then form. Note that the first part of the sentence states the independent variable, and the second part states the dependent variable. Example for how you phrase your hypothesis. 1, if a first-year student start attending more lectures, then their exam score will improve. That is for the first example. For the second example, we can also say that if there is more primary and secondary enrollment in a given country, then economic growth will increase. The sixth criteria is to write both the null and the alternate hypothesis. The null hypothesis is the default position that there is no association between the variables. And the reverse is true for the alternative hypothesis. So the null hypothesis can be written as HO, while the alternate hypothesis is written as H1 or HA, depending on the book or the textbook that you are using. This brings us to the types of research hypothesis. The null and the alternate, okay, as we saw from these previous slides, writing down both the null and the alternate hypothesis. If your research involves statistical hypothesis testing, you also have to write a null hypothesis and alternate hypothesis. No doubt about that. The null hypothesis is the default position that there is no association between the study variables, while the alternative hypothesis states that there is an association between the study variables. That is the reverse to the null. Alternate is the reverse to the null. Okay? So the null hypothesis is written as HO. The alternate hypothesis could either be H1 or HA, depending on the textbook that you are using. Let's take a typical example of how to state hypothesis in your research project or in your statistical analysis. Let's take, for example, if we consider the second example, that is the education and economic growth. The null hypothesis read that there is no significant relationship between educational output, such as primary and secondary school enrollment, and economic growth in Ghana. The alternate hypothesis that negates all that is a reverse to the null hypothesis also reads that there exists a significant relationship between educational output, such as primary and secondary school enrollment, and economic growth in Ghana. In this particular scenario, you see that the null is saying there is no significant relationship, but the alternative is saying that they may exist, okay, a significant relationship, at least one of the educational output may have a significant influence or relationship or impact on the dependent variable, that's the economic growth. Let's tease out the variables in the hypothesis. If you look at the alternate hypothesis, okay, we have educational output highlighted in green, and that reflects that of what? The independent variable. Because if you guys recall that the hypothesis should specify, okay, it should specify the first part, okay, the independent variable in the first part, and the second part, the dependent variable. So if you come to this particular example, you realize that the first part of the relationship is the educational output, and the second part is the economic growth, that is the dependent variable. So in the first part, the first part, okay, the variable there is the independent variable, that is the educational output, and the second part is the economic growth, that is the dependent variable. There is no control variable in this particular hypothesis, but in your main regression analysis, you may see some of the control variables, because you need to take note of them so that you should be able to give an account, a critical account and a detailed account on the subject matter that you want to explain, like the economic growth, because you want to always avoid the spiral results. You don't want your results to be biased, because education output is not the only factor that may contribute to economic growth. There are other factors like inflation, population growth, and several other factors. All right. Thank you very much for subscribing. In summary, every research project or study, remember that hypothesis is in two parts: null hypothesis and alternate hypothesis. Thank you very much for subscribing to GIFS TV. We will see you all in the next video. Thank you.